recording.
Thanks, James. Okay, here's our agenda for today. We have done introductions. You met the presentation team. We have met all of you in the chat. I'm going to take a little time in the beginning to talk a little bit about PCEF, how we got to where we are, and what the application process looks like. Then Durrell will jump in with kind of some high-level pointers on her approach to grant writing. And then she'll jump in specifically to building the budget, and she'll provide a real example of connecting budget elements to the PCEF application. And then we'll have time for, hopefully a good amount of time for questions and answers. Okay, how did we get where we are today? Co-creating the grant making process is a cornerstone of PCEF and will continue to be so. The application process builds on the original community vision. So where did the community vision come from? Well, it actually started probably well before November 2018, but November 2018 was a very important milestone in the history of the Clean Energy Fund, in that the Portland Clean Energy Initiative was passed by voters. And so we were underway at that point. By November 2019, the full grant committee had been appointed. And then shortly thereafter, on March 2020, we had generated draft guiding principles and put those out for public comment. We gathered the public comment and made adjustments, and the guiding principles were approved by the committee on April 2020. Then staff got to work drafting the application and the scoring criteria, and that was released for public comment in June of 2020. We received a lot of comment, a lot of input, and incorporated it all and came out with a final application and scoring criteria, which was a component of the RFP, which was released recently here in September 2020. And here we are today in our training webinar phase of the RFP. And as we all hopefully know already, applications are due on November 16th. That's when your work gets to slow down a little bit and our work speeds up significantly. And that's when we will conduct technical and feasibility reviews of the applications. The applications will be reviewed by scoring panels and selections will be made. And the grants will be awarded in February 2021. And then we start the whole process over again. I will say that in the start the whole process over again, that PCEF will continue to be an iterative process. We will be building, learning, and growing along with all of you, and community will continue to be a significant component of that. The thing we don't do is have the ideas and make the proposals. So now is the time for community members like you to be in the driver's seat, bringing the best ideas for climate action that will also advance racial and social justice. So, guiding principles, very important. The grant committee developed a set of principles to guide the program, that's the basis for everything that we do. And these guiding principles describe the values by which the PCEF program is administered. And we're constantly asking ourselves in everything that we do, how does this connect to our guiding principles? The guiding principles complement the legislative code and help ensure that decisions are being made in a way that aligns with the vision and the values of the committee and the community. So those guiding principles are that PCEF is primarily justice driven. It is absolutely community powered and will continue to be so. And it is accountable. We're accountable. We are absolutely transparent in all of the work that we do and how we fund and who we fund. Okay, here's the part where we get to start talking about you. So who is eligible to apply? You have to be a current nonprofit, and that means that you are IRS tax exempt and an active registered nonprofit with the state of Oregon, and not on the disqualified charities list with the Oregon Department of Justice. Now, we encourage partnering with eligible applicants to develop projects for applications. However, nonprofits who are partnering with non-eligible entities, they cannot simply act as a pass-through for grant funding. They need to be an active component of the project and partnership. Now, one thing that we know, and an important part of the PCEF goal, is that PCEF will be funding and will be serving to uplift organizations that are new and emerging and may not have incorporated as nonprofits yet. In this case, applying through a fiscal sponsor is an available avenue for application. At a high level, a fiscal sponsor should share the values and mission of the applicant organization or project. More information on fiscal sponsorship can be found on our website. You're going to see a lot of URLs in this presentation. They're lengthy. Don't try to kill yourself by writing them all down. The slides are available, and I think maybe we have already put them in the chat. If we haven't already, we will put them in the chat, a link to the slides, and you'll be able to flip through the slides and find all the URLs that way. Okay, I just want to do a quick check to see if we have any questions yet. Nope, looks like we're okay. Oh, there is a question, which I'll go ahead and grab. And anybody, is being a new and emerging nonprofit a requirement? And absolutely not. Not a requirement, but definitely something that we are open to and would like to support. And if any other staff has any more clarification like to offer on that, feel free.
This is Janet here. Yeah, you'll notice that there's a question that talks about your track record or history of serving priority populations. So, one could read that to think you're favored if you're existing, but we definitely didn't want to weed out folks that are new. And so there's definitely not any screening out or priority for your newness.
Thanks, Janet. That's helpful. Okay. I'm going to grab this question right now because it just popped up. The program is only open to Oregon applicants. Actually, I'm going to ask for a little bit of help with this. The program is really only open to City of Portland applicants. And do you want to clarify that, James, please?
Yeah, so the organization that is applying does have to be a registered nonprofit with the state of Oregon. They don't have to be registered in Portland, but for the purposes of PCEF, if there's construction activities that are being funded or infrastructure being put in, then that work has to happen within the city of Portland boundaries. And then also, if there's workforce components or training components, those are intended to serve Portlanders. A program could serve additional people living outside of Portland as well, but the parts that PCEF can pay for are related to serving Portlanders. And that's because the ballot initiative was voted by Portland voters and is also kind of jurisdictionally bound a little bit. But no, the organization does not have to be from Oregon, but they have to have a registration in Oregon as a nonprofit.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. Moving on. So what kinds of projects can be funded? There's basically 4 different types of projects that can be funded. The biggest bucket, 40 to 60% of the funding, will go towards clean energy projects. These are renewable energy efficiency projects. They can be for residential, commercial, or school properties. At least half of the projects under this category must specifically benefit low-income residents and people of color. The next bucket of funding, 20 to 25% of each of the annual funding, will be for contractor training and support for workforce development. This includes job training, apprenticeship programs, business technical assistance with a focus on economically disadvantaged workers and businesses. The next bucket, 10 to 15%, is for green infrastructure and regenerative agriculture. This category can quite literally be understood as all things green, things that grow and sequester greenhouse gas, improve water quality, and create a healthier urban environment. So think trees, urban farming, bioswales. And then finally, we have 5% reserved for innovation. So these are projects that don't fit into one of these other categories, but still support climate action goals in a way that advance racial and social equity. And this year, for year one, we are awarding $8.6 million. Year two, we anticipate between $40 and $60 million. Okay, so how does that 8.6 get divided up? First, there's 3 different types of grants within each of these kind of categories. There's planning grants, small grants, or large grants. So planning grants can be for up to $100,000. And in this grant cycle, we are actually reserving 1.5 million of the 8.6 specifically for planning grants. And the reason for that is that this is a building year for all of us. And we want to encourage applicants to take the opportunity that the planning grants present to build robust resourced and research projects. Small grants, which are grants up to 200,000, and can be, again, in any one of the categories: clean energy, green infrastructure, workforce development. And then large grants, same, but they are from 200,000 to $1 million. And then for innovation, we don't have a designated funding level in this grant cycle. So we're kind of going to wait and see what we get. Our next RFP will likely come out in the summer of 2021. And once again, will be $40 to $60 million. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the application. We're going to go through this at a higher level and a bit more quickly than we have in our application webinars. If you already attended one of those, there will be some overlap here. If you haven't attended an application webinar, we have one more on the schedule, Wednesday, October 28th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. We also have one more grant writing training, which is an open Q&A session. That's on Monday, October 26th from noon to 1:30. If you'd like to register for either of those, I think we will go ahead and throw a link in the chat that will take you directly to the registration. There it is. Thank you, Janet. Plus, we have recorded all of our previous trainings. So, and you can access those at that very same link. You just go to, you'll see the line with the webinar, and you'll see where the recorded training is. So, you know, could be a little fun Friday night with the fam. Okay, getting started. We have put together a thorough collection of application guidance and information in several different formats and languages, starting here at the Guide to PCEF Grant Application Process page. And some things to note about this page: you'll see a table of contents. If you click on any of the blue text on this page, it will take you directly to the place on the page that speaks to these items. And so this page is really, it's about kind of the, are you eligible? How can you use this money? How are the applications going to be evaluated? And then there are a number of resource links, which we'll talk a little bit more about, including the link that we just put up in the chat for you, which is the link to the webinars. This is where you will find the recorded sessions of past webinars and registration links for our 2 upcoming webinars, so don't miss out. Okay, additional resources. This is a link that does not contain any essential application materials. You don't ultimately have to go here. These are just things that we thought might be useful resources to you while you apply, and wanted to save you the time of looking for them. It's a lot of links to other government and city websites with information and data relevant to the types of projects that PCEF funding might support. All right, ready to apply? You'll need the full RFP materials. These are available from the Apply for PCEF Grant button, which is located at the bottom of that guide page we were just looking at. They are in neat, not very little, but neat packets that can be downloaded, and you want to download the whole packet. There is a packet for each grant type: large, small, and planning. Be sure you download the correct packet. Some of the components of the packets that you won't want to miss. We have included several documents which help you know what you're getting yourself into. including the sample grant agreement. So this gives you an idea of what an organization will need to sign with us once they get awarded their grant. The workforce contractor equity agreement options, the wage requirements, reporting requirements, and then specific to clean energy projects, we have given some information about verification requirements, which in some cases include third-party verification, and you want to be sure that you're aware of those so that you're budgeting for them. Okay, and then other documents that you might find interesting, the application question guidance. This is a super important pivotal document. I would not skip this one. It basically goes through every single question and says, this is what this question is about, and here's what we're looking for in this question. And then the definition section is certainly valuable. If you're curious how we're defining any particular term in the application, you probably will find it in the definitions. All right. In the packets, you will find the required attachments for your application, not the least of which is this one here, attachment B, your budget template. There are 2 tabs and 3 main elements. Project and personnel detail table is located on one tab. What you enter in the personnel detail tab will automatically populate components of the project table, so do that first. And try not to enter data into any fields which are shaded. These contain formulas which will automate the math. Generally, you should not need to add additional lines to the project budget table. We've had people ask this a couple of times. Your project expenses should fit into a category which is already defined in the table. If you have a question about where to account for a particular project expense, we can help with that. Let us know. The other table, the other worksheet in this template is the leverage table. Leverage is not required, but if you have it, you want to include it here. And we'll talk a little bit more about leverage later. Okay. Use of funds. So we're calling attention to these elements so that applicants will get 2 things. First, know what is allowed. And second, to be encouraged to think creatively. Now, I don't think that we see this as an exhaustive list, but we wanted to give applicants an idea of how expansive the thinking can be around what can be funded.
I did want to
yeah, go ahead.
Back just for one clarifying piece. I should have actually updated this slide with an edit that we had made, which is related to in the upper right corner, reimbursement for items procured or work completed prior to the effective date of a grant application that should read are not allowable costs. So just a clarification that really work that's been previously done can't be paid for after the fact by PCEF grants prior to receiving the grant, let's say. So that is just a quick piece of clarification I want to provide for folks. Most of the other, this is really a list of highlighting different elements of what is allowed and considerations related to those topics that we do have more detail on that link, which I'll go ahead and also post in the chat here momentarily. So.
Great, and we'll make the adjustment to the slide deck. Yeah. So when you go to download the slides later, you'll see the updated version.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Okay. Budget tips and reminders. So super important. Budget for what you need. PCEF is not a lowest cost wins program. Apply for the funding needed to do the project. If you're doing construction, remember to include contingency. I have personally not ever been involved in a construction project that didn't require contingency. If you have, well done. But you want to anticipate that that won't happen. If your project is multi-year, make sure you are budgeting enough money to meet the PCEF wage requirements in all the years, and they're going to change. So you need to be looking at that. Okay, pay attention to the caps. Your overhead cap is 20% of your total project cost. I have a question about that actually, James, maybe that you can answer for me. It's the total project cost, not 20% of your PCEF grant, correct?
Correct. It's of the, that is correct, of the individual project cost.
Okay, thank you. Your fiscal sponsor fee can be up to 10% of your project cost. then if you have both a fiscal sponsor and overhead, you're capped at 25% total for both. And then we know that a lot of the buildings that are, whether they're residences or commercial buildings that we're going to be working on are going to need other work done in order to enable the energy efficiency work and the renewable work to be done in those buildings. And so up to 30% of your funding can be used for the non-energy related building improvements that are needed. Also, in terms of how the payout on the grant works, generally it'll be paid through reimbursement, but partial advance options will be available, and those will be discussed and negotiated with your project manager.
Wendy, can I just ask one question as well to clarify on if your project is multi-year, make sure you're budgeting enough money to meet all years. And so you would be including, so if you have a multi-year, that whole project number for say for example, it's 3 years, will all go in to the one budget worksheet, correct?
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Yes, you want to put all of your years, and we've had that question before. You don't want to break out by years. Your one budget worksheet, you're going to have one total for your entire project. And then, if you are awarded, then the breakout will become important at that point. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
This is Janet here, just to, you're certainly welcome to, you'll need those numbers broken out as you build your budget, because you probably have a sense of what you're doing and when you're doing it, and developing your budget, which Darrell's going to get to. So you might have you should have your more detailed budget in the background, but it's an aggregate number that's entered here. And you can certainly note in that description area or another section, like my request is for X, year 1, this amount, year 2, this amount, or something like that.
Okay, thanks, Janet. It looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat. So let's see, are any of these clarifying questions? Maybe they look like they're stack questions, which are the ones I think that we want to hold for the end. So we'll get to those in the end. Okay, so you've brought together all of your application materials, you've downloaded the application packets, you got everything together, you're ready to submit your application. There's a couple of different ways that you can do that. You can use our online portal, which has some distinct advantages in that when you submit through the online portal, there are questions, depending on the type of project that you're doing, there's questions in the application which you don't have to fill out. And you have to be sure that when you're doing the paper application, that you are reading the instructions, but the online application, once you select the type of project you're doing, will skip those automatically for you. So that's one of the nice features of the online application. One of the things the online application doesn't do is it's not a great collaboration tool for your team. It's basically one login can get into the application, and so it's something that you want to do at the very end. And you kind of want to entrust with your person who is primarily responsible with submitting your application. And so there is a link to the application that it goes directly from that apply page that you can see linked here on this slide. You don't have to use the online portal. We would love it if you did. If you don't want to, you can also submit hard copies to either our email, which is cleanenergyfund@portlandoregon.gov, or you can mail us hard copies at the address there at the bottom of the slide. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darrell.
Thank you, Wendy. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, if you weren't here during the introductions, again, my name is Darrell Kalika. I am working with the PCEF staff on the training I am not a part of PCEF staff. I'm actually a contractor and similarly positioned to probably a lot of you. In full disclosure, I work for, I own my own company, but we work with nonprofits, helping them write grants and manage their grants and so forth. And so the perspective I'm offering today is sort of the process with which that we work with the organizations, helping them with their grants and so forth. And then also in full transfer, I'm not applying, none of my organizations I work with are applying for PCEF at this time. So, so anyhow, so I'm just offering sort of one perspective in terms of how you can formulate and put together your budget with regard to this particular request for proposals. So let's go ahead, if we could skip to go to the next slide. And I'd also like to invite the PCEF staff to jump in at any point if I've missed anything, or if there's any additions that you'd like to make with regard to anything I've said. Could we advance to the next slide? Okay. So I'm going to, and we're going to kind of go quickly. I know that we've finished up the past 2 narrative building sessions, and I'm just sort of quickly going to go through this just as sort of a way to kind of connect the process of developing sort of the entire proposal and taking into consideration the narrative building components that we've already concentrated on, and just kind of reaffirming that you've gone through the exercise of building the narrative. And in this particular portion, we're really looking at now, how do you back up sort of all of the sort of project descriptions and answers within the budget itself. So let's go ahead and advance to the next slide. So as I've mentioned previously in others, in the past webinars, and I'm just to reaffirm in this one, a large component of preparing the application process is really information management. And what I think is particularly relevant for budget processes, as you're preparing to apply and taking into consideration what it is in terms of your project, is really, I think, developing a clear understanding of what it is that you're looking to propose to do. And so we'll probably get into this a little more, and I'll hopefully have our folks on the PCEF team answer a little bit more, because we know that some of your projects, I mean, the whole sort of PCEF framework is really set, as I understand it, to be responsive to the needs of the communities it's meant to benefit and the principles that it's meant to benefit. So it leaves us sort of room for being able to put your program and project within this sort of framework. And so taking that into consideration, we know there's going to be kind of components of different buckets of these, you know, the projects and potentially planning components. So the other piece is in terms of considering with regard to the preparation of the budget for this particular proposal process is really, you know, taking into consideration, you know, having your files and documents ready. For the purposes of budget 2 is also having your financial documents in order to respond to some of those sections before. And then I think with regard to the preparation in terms of thinking about what's going to be needed, you know, taking the time to sort of really plan out how you're going to be, 1, putting the narrative together, but 2, really concentrating on how you're going to be putting your budget together. The budget could potentially be as maybe a more significant chunk of your time and your grant preparation timeline than maybe putting together your narrative could be. So if we could go to the next slide. So in terms of taking into consideration, again, this is kind of just weaving in a bit of the process for narrative building. So in taking into consideration, you've all done the sort of thought process around what the project is going to be, what you're looking to do, and then also, of course, taking into consideration eligibility, and was previously mentioned with regard to fiscal sponsors and the role of fiscal sponsors, and making sure that that's an active role in terms of this particular proposal. And so really, I would like to underscore that, because as I've prepared grants at times, I've kind of gone back and forth over, are we eligible? Is this an eligible project? And so I think that's something very clear to establish at the very front end of this process. And then, of course, has already been mentioned, is been, going through, reading the PCEF information, getting a clear understanding. There's a lot of information to go through, and you're probably going to be going through parts of it over again. So, and then, of course, developing your preparation plan, having that checklist of materials that's already provided in many of the files that were already highlighted in the resources tabs. And then I think really for this purpose, for the budget building, is establishing your timeline in terms of thinking about what needs to get done between now and preparation of the final proposal, which includes the narrative. There's a lot of research that goes into that, which I'll get into in the next slide, but making sure you give yourself a generous amount of time to accomplish what's needed to get the information necessary to respond and get submitted. And then, of course, just being clear with regard to, what it is that you're looking to accomplish, and establishing those project goals and so forth, and building out your own sort of project timeline and milestones as well. We could go to the next slide. So particularly for this process is really, both related to narrative and budget and submission, is the research and gathering component. And I think research is particularly important for the budget process, because you're going to also potentially, depending upon the type of project, whether it's a planning project, small or large, is going to require an amount of time dedicated to gathering information, whether that's gathering information about contract vendors, construction vendors, or if you're doing training, it may involve a host of training vendors. And so part of that is going to be, gathering that information and being able to sort of collect that, go through that, and sort of synthesize that, and then be able to put that into the budget worksheet. And before even putting it in the budget worksheet, being able to go through that information and find how that's valuable to what it is that you're looking to accomplish, going back to those sort of project goals and objectives, as well as kind of the overall vision of what you're looking to accomplish. And by vision, I mean, taking a look at that. If you're looking at a 3 to 5 year type of a project, what is it by the end of 3 to 5 years you're hoping to have realized? And so here we are today, really kind of going to take a deeper dive into talking about building a budget. And there's kind of two approaches that folks can take to developing a grant. There's kind of those folks that gravitate towards putting their narratives together first, and those that gravitate towards budget first. And I have no opinion either way. I'm sort of neutral on that, because it's a matter of preference. But for the purposes of this, we're just really going to concentrate on the budget building component and how you start to populate those numbers, and not just for the worksheet, but for yourself, and especially not just for yourself, but also taking into consideration the timeline, not just for the preparation of this grant, but the timeline of your actual project. And the other consideration is, is sort of the internal protocols that your organization may have. Some organizations, depending upon sort of size and scope and just organizational structure and capacity, may have a very streamlined process for maybe internal controls and approvals, or there may be more involved kind of controls and approvals that may be there. So, for example, the organization that I work with requires the executive director and the board to approve certain types of proposals, especially if they're going to take place over a series of multiple years. So being able to not only have our proposal in the narrative form ready, but also being able to submit and share the budget with our board is also a consideration. So kind of having all of that information and timeline in hand is really important, but also a consideration in terms of being able to answer and articulate, how you arrived at some of your budget numbers. And then of course, kind of taking all of this information and getting it into a format that's ready to submit. And of course, there's the exciting part, which is the actual submission process, which is always that, as Wendy said, you get to, have that sort of sigh of relief once you get that submitted and that process takes place. So if we could go to the next slide. So this slide is really just sort of to demonstrate or the sort of approach that I take. And again, that's just one perspective in terms of how I manage the set of information that I'm collecting. Generally, I'm building myself a timeline, creating sort of a master file for this particular proposal. Within that file, I'll have different subfiles. And of course, one of those subfiles I would recommend if you're new to grant writing is to have a file dedicated to your budget building process. And within that file, you'll have things like, well, the budget worksheet and the leverage worksheet, which are already provided. But within that, you'll probably have maybe contacts, folks that you've been in contact with as you're starting to do that research, and gathering information may be included in there. You may have quotes or just contact information for folks that you've talked with. And so that would be kind of included in that. That's what I tend to do and rely on, again, to manage the amount of information that you're gathering, but also the amount of information that's already presented to you by the PCEF folks and on the website and so forth. And then just sort of as sort of further tips within that master file, I have the narrative building file. And then of course, my favorite sub file in that master file is the final submission file. That's, for me, I like to-do lists, and once I can take stuff and scratch it off my to-do list and put it in that final file ready to submit, it just is so, it's rewarding to have that progress. So if we could go to the next slide.
And Jarrell, we do have one question. I think
Sure.
you might have kind of just answered it, but the question is, on average, how long does it take for the research and gather to submission of the application?
I think that's going to vary by project, and it's going to vary by, to me, this is just my experience, it's going to vary by sort of the complexity of the project. If you have multiple components to that, then that's going to potentially require a little more time to do that. And again, it really will depend, and I can get a little more into that in some preceding slides of maybe a little more details, and we can maybe tease out a little bit more questions about that, because kind of taking into consideration and looking during the introductions, folks' specific sort of survey of interest, whether that's workforce development, training, workshop building, outreach, and so forth, it's really going to vary on needs. And so I can talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so I'll put a pin in that one.
That makes sense.
Just remind me to do that. So, okay. We can go to the next slide. So as we begin, talking about building the budget piece, one of the key things is really starting to, one, again, don't lose sight. This is, again, just my advice as a colleague and as folks who are new to writing grants or newer, is to really make sure, again, you don't lose sight of what your vision is as you're starting to integrate your vision, particularly your budget, into the PCEF worksheets and workbooks, and looking through the guidance material that's provided. So just, again, just really, I want to make sure if there's anything, just keep that in vision, because sometimes, when I'm writing grants, it's sort of this sort of kind of push and pull, and it's kind of by the end I'm wondering, okay, how much does this look like what I wanted to do versus me trying to be responsive or to fit into this grant, and it's sort of who's driving who. And so far from what I've deciphered or read from, basically, this is probably, to me, one of the most user-friendly grants that I've looked at in a while. So yeah, so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this slide really is just an indicator. So to give you kind of just the framework of when you click into the actual application portal itself, taking a look at the planning, small project and large project applications. So if say you're looking in a planning grant, this is just kind of to demonstrate or be illustrative for you to see sort of the other added sections that a small project or large project have in comparison and the sort of demand for information. But what's common to all three of these buckets of funding and opportunity is the budget component, which is where we are today. So we can go to the next slide. So again, so this is just maybe a different take and different version or visual on a slide that was previously presented by Wendy, which is on understanding the use of funds. So as someone who prepares grants, myself taking a look at this actual funding opportunity, I had to wrap my head around what that actually meant in terms of use of funds. And my brain naturally went to use of funds and what is not allowed as a use of funds. So this is really, as I've been, in conversation and hearing from the folks at PCEF, that these are sort of, a menu of different uses of the PCEF grant funds, but that there is this sort of room in there for what it is in terms that you need. However, there are some costs that are probably going to be pretty universal among most folks, particularly specifically overhead costs. I don't know of anybody who does not have overhead costs included in their grant proposal, and overhead costs ranging from everything from, sort of your indirect rate to staff that's helping to, the office and keeping lights on. So that's kind of, it's one of those inclusive numbers that just kind of has to be there and included in the budget. So again, I just kind of wanted to show this in a different format with regard to considering use of funds, but I'd also like to make sure I'm not misstating anything. So I'll just quickly do a check with the PCEF folks on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Darrell. And I guess I want to clarify something that I had said earlier, because what we mean by what I meant by project, or how I interpreted that, was the amount applied for by PCEF. So if the overhead thresholds that we provide and have guidance for apply for the amount of funding that PCEF is contributing to a project. If there's other funds, it doesn't apply to those funds. So it's really contained within the amount being applied for, those 10% and 25% thresholds. And I actually do see a question related to this, related to overhead from Vito. Are there requirements for overhead costs for planning grants? And these same kind of overall thresholds do apply throughout. I'm almost, I guess one of my other colleagues can jump in if I'm stating that inaccurately, but I believe that these thresholds of overhead costs are throughout and the fiscal sponsorship, for instance, that 10% guidance, that applies to all types of grants.
All right. Okay. And let's see, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So just taking a brief pause here as we kind of start to think about the process for building a budget. I just really wanted to take this, the way I look at it, because you're looking at you're looking at developing a budget for something that you're preparing to happen in the future. And in terms of thinking about that, there are things that you know and that you can sort of forecast and do some scenario planning around, but there are going to be other features that are going to arise down the road that you didn't anticipate. And so then kind of how do you build that all into the budget process? So the analogy that I tend to use is thinking about going on a camping trip. and kind of defining, how you look at that. You're sitting at your house, you're getting ready to go to your camping destination and campsite, wherever that may be, whatever time of year that may be, however long you are going, and trying to forecast, what am I going to need to bring? Am I going to be, have all the things that I need to make this as comfortable a trip as possible, and to have it be enjoyable, and to ideally, maybe your goal to go camping is to relax and enjoy yourself. And so hopefully that you're able to sort of to take this sort of analogy of a camping trip and take that and translate that into building your budget. So in terms of thinking about that, in terms of thinking about if it's a planning project, there's a goal at the end of the planning process that you're hoping to arrive at. If it's a small project, there's a destination or goal that you're hoping to end and arrive at. Similarly, the same can be said for a large project. So going into that goal is, what are you going to need? And being able to forecast that as best as you can. You don't want to forecast not enough and be miserable in the process. Like if you were to not pack enough on a camping trip, you'd be miserable. You want to be able to pack your budget enough with enough stuff that you can accomplish it. But you don't want to pack so much that it's unnecessary, and you have stuff and it becomes unmanageable and unreasonable. And I think that's really the key takeaway, I think, in terms of kind of thinking about this process and building the budget, gathering your numbers and putting that together is to me a reasonableness standard of putting together a budget. And that's where going into doing the research process, sort of understanding, having a clear understanding of what it is that you're looking to accomplish with a planning project, small or large project, and really being able to articulate and design what that's going to look like in particular. So what I'm going to be doing is again, sort of kind of switching gears a little bit from the actual hard information that you're getting directly from the PCEF budget. And I'm going to sort of take you through an exercise of walking through sort of what it kind of looks like and feels like to put together a budget with actual real life scenarios. And the example I'm going to be using is built off of a project that I worked on. It's not a PCEF proposal. It was never funded by the city or anything. It was actually a regional proposal, and but it has elements that are very similar. That to this type of or seemingly would be appropriate in terms of in spirit to something similar. And then I'm going to take that and expound upon that to what that would look like if we were to take it from, so the first example is going to be a planning project, which is a real life project, to the second piece, which is just a hypothetical project that actually involves physical improvements and sort of more construction and small project components. But before I go into that example, I just wanted to do another check with folks on PCEF as I jump in. If they're good, I'm gonna just go for it. Okay, all right. Okay, if we could go to the next slide. So I'm going to really be watching my time here. So I'm going to take you through an example, and like I just kind of outlined. So the example here is really one that I've actually gone through. It was essentially a planning project to build energy efficiency, knowledge and capacity for the tribal residential sector. And we were working directly with tribes in the Pacific Northwest, or tribal communities. And there was a gap in terms of a lack of capacity around energy efficiency in tribal communities, kind of across all sectors. But the lowest hanging fruit that we identified was in the housing sector. And there's already housing offices in tribal communities and working with folks. There's already sort of a workforce in tribal housing, but no capacity for energy efficiency. And so we saw this unmet need with regard to building that capacity and working with the community to do some more education and outreach on the benefits of energy efficiency, the benefits of reaching out to the utility that serves you. And sort of second within that was the need and recognition that we need to start working with housing offices to start to build their internal capacity around energy efficiency and conservation and workforce development. So that involved a training component and training events involved in that. And then the last goal that we had was through this process was to be able to identify opportunities for a pilot project or maybe a couple of pilot projects that various tribes in the Pacific Northwest could take and run with and apply for grants for themselves. So that's sort of the initial, that's the planning project that I've already worked on, has already been completed. Today, what I'm going to do is I thought I'd take us through a hypothetical, taking that last goal that we were hoping to accomplish in our previous planning effort, and say, what if we ran that through, just again, hypothetically, as a small project, potentially for PCEF down the road, I don't know, or something else, maybe it's Department of Energy, US Department. So the thought being is kind of taking a look at what would be required to do a small project grant. How would you build a budget around that? So for the benefit of today is really, I'm just taking that hypothetical to help inform how you would go about gathering information, what kind of information you would need to begin building your budget around maybe it's equipment, contractors, insurance personnel. So that's kind of the way we're going to walk through this is in this kind of two-step piece. And again, taking it in bite-sized pieces, which the first piece is talking about sort of the planning component, which again has been already accomplished. So we can go to the next slide. So again, this is just kind of a different version and maybe a little more detailed version of a planning, going from planning to an actual project. And in consideration of that, I'll be very specific of the things that have already been accomplished. Excuse me. The first was, doing the community outreach and capacity building, starting to set up and develop the receptivity to provide public information around energy efficiency, as well as working with community leaders, and then directly working with staff and personnel to develop a training commitment to participate in training events and workshops. And so that's really kind of that first piece, was getting that level of commitment from folks to participate in our actual project. The second involved the actual training events and building a budget around what does it actually take to train and help build and develop a workforce for this particular area in the tribal housing sector. And so specifically, we were looking at 3 different training events in Oregon and Washington, and looking at sort of target numbers of around 30 to 50 people, and looking to link tribal communities with actual energy efficiency experts and resource providers and so forth, and then being able to provide some technical assistance and peer-to-peer support. So, and then the last piece we'll kind of get into in the next part of in the hypothetical component. So if we can go to the next slide. So it's not required to have this level of detail put into the PCEF budget itself. But what is helpful for this level of detail, so this specific example is related to the training events I just mentioned. And specifically looking at, again, we were looking to have 3 of them. And what we did is we started, kind of calling around to folks in Oregon and Washington and starting to get information about specifically venues. That was sort of our biggest need, was looking at where are we going to hold these training events. And so that began our process of researching and gathering information to inform the budget and the grant proposal around what are we going to need for each training event. And as you can see, we determined that to pull off one training event, taking every sort of thing we could think of with regard to hosting that event, it cost $21,000 per, and we average that, that's about what it costs per training event. And this budget helped us build sort of what that number is. So that included, you know, personnel time. That included having a contractor, which included somebody who could do the training. Of course, including the venue. And when you start looking at venue, you run into different cost categories. So say for example, this example, there was a food and catering cost as well. So we had to break that out. And then there was, of course, audiovisual, and then there's training materials, travel, and so forth. So there are going to be costs, and part of this particular example and this particular budget resulted from us having a clear vision of what we wanted to do and sort of a set of questions that we had going into it. But as we started approaching, particularly this vendor who was the venue, being able to ask questions, get information to begin building our budget. And so through that, you know, we sort of had to distill this down and be able to break these out as we were working to be able to take this information and put it in a budget worksheet, very similar to the PCEF budget worksheet. We were able to start categorizing and figuring out, okay, how much is personnel, how much is contract labor? And so we did this exercise for all 3 training sessions, and we're able to aggregate all of these numbers and be able to start to take that and put it in the actual budget worksheet. Because as has been already said, there's one worksheet and it's very simplified, and you're gonna have to, this information is going to be really important, mainly for you as you're putting together your actual inputs into the PCEF budget worksheet. So, all right. If we could go to the next slide. So now I'm going to kind of advance forward. So we've gone through the planning phase. We know what's next. We know that there's an unmet need around taking things to the next level, which is installing. In this example, I'm using, you know, improvements around heating. It could be really kind of any energy efficiency application. So you don't have to get hugely caught up on what it actually is, but some of the things taking into consideration for a project budget is taking in, you know, having, again, that sort of clear understanding of what it is that you're looking to accomplish. And this becomes, to me, really important when you're starting to do that research and information gathering. So in this example, you know, say we're looking to do some energy efficiency applications, and we want to do them on 25 housing units, so we know at least a quantity. We have a profile of what the, you know, those homes or those 25 units look like. We have an idea of what type of equipment we're looking to utilize. I mean, here we have heating. It could be solar. It could be some other type of application. But again, the thought being is really having a clear and articulated idea of what we're looking to accomplish. And to also take into consideration, you know, what's going to include physical improvements in construction, and what's going to not require physical improvements in construction. And that becomes important when you start to look at the PCEF worksheet itself. And what I'd like to sort of just to make sure that I flag for you why this becomes really important and having a clear understanding of your project goals is as you start to reach out and start to gather information to inform your budget, it's really important. So if we could go to the next slide. So this is an example of a project budget. It could be small, it could be large. The main point of this is really to demonstrate or to provide. I did not fill any of the numbers in because this is, again, hypothetical. what I would be doing in terms of, looking at this and looking how would I populate these different categories if I were to be looking at a project budget would be, taking into consideration my organization's actual personnel, taking into consideration the staff that's involved, is how much time is, my executive director going to be involved? How much time will the accountant be involved? And so, that those are things that are important. Perhaps you have some folks already on staff that have capacity to dedicate towards the actual physical improvements component. So in this developing this particular budget line item, it really does start to get into sort of a granular sort of level. And that's where this becomes important for you to be able to figure out and being realistic about how much time, how much of, whether it's an FTE is going to be devoted to some of these categories. Taking what I really want to start to point to is contract labor in terms of considering how do you gather that information about contract labor. And if anything, there's multiple different approaches that you can take. So let's just say, for example, you have a project you're looking to develop, and it's going to require the hiring of construction labor or even non-construction labor. So how do you go about getting that information? And maybe you already have a partner in mind, but I think for that meeting that reasonableness standard, it's important to gather information about other variables and other variable costs and other vendors. They may have different rates, and they may have different rates for different reasons. And those reasons may be important and helpful to you as you're informing yourself, but informing your actual budget. And in terms of thinking about that. And so as I was, articulating this, we had a conversation amongst the PCEF staff last night, and that was one of the things that was asked of me is how would you approach, working and getting some of these numbers with regard to working with vendors. And, for different projects, I have different approaches, and it really depends on what it is that we're looking to do and what we're looking to accomplish, and whether or not the organization I'm working with or whether I have actual experience with it varies. So my approach to it varies. So oftentimes I generally tend to go with, I'm going to ask who I know and to find out what it is that I don't know and how to approach it, particularly. So I've been working on energy issues for a while. So I kind of know some folks and have some folks that I know in this community and sector. So if I know that they have worked on or know about a similar type of project I'm looking to accomplish, I tend to reach out to those people and start to ask them questions about, can you tell me a little bit more about that particular project? Was there a project manager that I could talk to? Were there some things that you could tell me a little bit more about that? And so it really becomes a research process. And again, this is my approach, is getting on the phone and calling people and talking to people. And I think it's really important that the bigger and the higher cost the project, definitely being able to have that sort of developing some resources around that information, and not being afraid to ask questions, and not being afraid to not always have the answers or not ask even sometimes the right questions. For the most part, I'm in this first scenario I'm kind of going with, or example, is really using that referral process of finding out who are good folks to work with, or who's done this type of work before, and being able to, and then reaching out to those folks that they refer me to. And that tends to be, and that's why I said when you're building your timeline and answering that question about how much time it takes to do the research and gathering and all, it really does vary. And sometimes I get lucky in my research process and I find those answers fairly quickly. Sometimes it takes me, so it's kind of hit or miss. And then sometimes it takes me a little longer than I had anticipated. So that's why I say it varies. if you don't have folks that you can talk to in your within sort of your contact portfolio, and that's definitely happened to me where I've come into sort of a wholly new subject area of a project I've never worked on. Sometimes I have to just do a little bit of kind of cold, what I kind of call cold call procurement, and starting to research resources, and taking a look. One thing that I think is unique for this particular presentation, because I primarily work with tribal communities, which are primarily rural. So we usually only have maybe 3 to 5 people we can even call on a subject or a service area. The variance here in Portland is you have quite a few different resources and particular vendors depending upon what your project type is, to have as resources to call. And so, what I'm kind of thinking about with regard to some of that cold call information is beginning to sort of ask questions about, letting them know that you're working on a funding proposal. Of course, a lot of these folks are business owners, like similar to me. I am a business owner, and I do get calls from people too asking for my services. And a lot of times, what I really appreciate is, and I know a lot of folks that are kind of in that sector appreciate, is just the sort of candid frankness that I get from folks saying, I'm working on a funding proposal. Do you have a few minutes to answer some questions for me about this is the project I'm looking to work on. Sort of these are my needs and requirements. And can you help me identify maybe some costs maybe that you know of, maybe some things that I'm not taking into consideration, and any other resources. And oftentimes, I am met, or I even myself will respond with, I don't have time to help you, or I do have a few moments to share with you a bit about, yes, this is how much it would cost to do X, Y, and Z. And they may ask you some additional questions that you didn't anticipate. But I think it's just really making sure that you're utilizing that time. And then the really, I think, important thing is being kind of, transparent at the beginning as to why you're reaching out to them. And the second thing is don't ever make any promises that, again, you're letting them know that you're doing some procurement information gathering, and you're trying to find out numbers and best information, and that you're looking to apply for a proposal, and you hope that you get it. And again, but you're not making any promises to them that you're going to hire them. But I think that that's kind of one of those sort of critical things in terms of thinking about, how you start to build some of this information and numbers, in terms of putting your budget together. And there may be more details that folks want to tease out from that, but I'm just kind of giving you sort of my experience and how I start putting together some of that research and gathering of information. And then one other piece that kind of occurred to me in terms of thinking about, where are some resources available if you're looking at sort of specific areas of service. And, I also thought of the specific chambers of commerce. So I work with the Oregon Native American Chamber of Commerce, and I know we work with other chambers of commerce within the state, serving, different diverse communities. And so last night I took a look at the website, and within even the ONAC website is broke down by service types. And so I didn't get a chance to look at the other chambers of commerce, but I'm just kind of pointing to, if you're having to start to look for resources, that potentially could be one potential resource to consider. So, so again, I'm just kind of walking you through this project budget to just kind of take into consideration, how you start to build that, particularly for a project which is, has some assets that may involve, shovels in the ground and so forth, that you don't necessarily see in a planning budget. Moreover, some of this you're going to be also having to consider over a multi-year process. And so again, that managing information over multiple years. I'm currently working on an energy efficiency project that has been over a 3-year period. So, so this sort of our own internal, this represents an internal working budget. Our internal working budget has multiple columns for multiple years. And so again, it's just keeping track of that particular information. So I just wanted to kind of pause there and let my colleagues at PCEF interject any ideas. Hopefully I didn't make anything add any confusion to this. I'm trying to really clarify as much as I can, but I wanted to give some time and pause to that if I can.
Yeah, I have just one quick piece, and then Janet, I think you do as well. Though I apologize, I didn't formally raise my hand. Just a note that when you think of what contract labor or contracted work means, it's not just construction, but it also would include partnerships with other nonprofits or other entities. So I think you did a great job, Dorel, of kind of laying that out of how it would apply to seeking out services, but also just noting for folks that might be engaging in a partnership with another nonprofit organization, but getting their estimates of their costs and what's required to implement the project that you're developing together. That also needs to be part of that kind of contracted work scope. And so that is something that you might already have those relationships and be able to develop if it is really kind of a couple nonprofits coming together to make a proposal, but there does always have to be a primary applicant. So just wanted to put that out there and pass it back to Janet for more.
Just add one thing onto that, because you did spur an idea really quickly, is thinking about that nonprofit partnership. And thank you for reminding me of that, because I have worked with different proposals where for example, we didn't have capacity in our organization built around communications and communications in media reporting, like video and radio. And so we worked with another nonprofit, and they were one of our contractors to help us with that. So, okay, sorry, Janet.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, just one riff on Dorel and James's comment, just to clarify on that piece about scoping out what the cost might be to build your budget and when there is or isn't a commitment. So sometimes there actually might be a commitment. For example, if you are submitting with the partnership and there is one of you, it's a consortium or a collaboration, and one of you is going to be the grant recipient, and then you're going to be contracting with those other partners, and you have fleshed out that budget, though those might be commitments. Or maybe you wanted to get a sense of we're going to install this solar panel, and I got a bid from 3 different contractors, and here's the one I'm submitting, and you are letting someone know, like, if we get the bid, are you the person, are you available? Because some of that can show up in your scoring, particularly on the large grants. So sometimes you're just trying to get a sense of, like, well, if we need to buy 100 shovels, let me call around and see how much that costs. Or if we need to get a rental hall, let me call around and find out what that costs. And there's not a commitment there, like, hey, I might get a grant and use your rental hall. So sometimes there is no commitment, but sometimes you are going to have those commitments and have them in the memo of understanding or something like that.
Okay.
Hey, Dorel, and this actually might be more of a staff question that just came up, one that I don't totally know the answer to, so I'm hoping some of my colleagues can help out. How do we handle overhead for contracted partners? Are the partner costs inclusive of overhead, or does overhead for primary and partner orgs go into the same cell in the template?
I think let's get to that once we actually look at the templates.
Okay. Okay.
And yeah, be happy to answer that question. So.
All right, we'll hold on that one for now.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me close out the chat here. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm kind of taking you on this journey of thinking about sort of what, at least from, one perspective of how you walk through putting together and informing and populating this particular worksheet. Again, that sort of, there's a lot of sort of work. I think I've equated it to an iceberg, that you've put in a lot of research and information, and what PCEF folks are going to see is just the top of that iceberg. You'll have cached away in your files or your master PCEF application file a lot of information that informs this particular worksheet. And as you can see, it's broken out into project costs associated with physical improvements and construction costs, which is kind of why I spent some time talking about putting a budget together from that perspective. And then there are project costs for non-physical, improvements. So that's, potentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, folks, that could be things that may be primarily included in a planning grant. So, taking into consideration, translating your information into this particular worksheet and putting that description in. Now, I haven't actually gone into that description box, but I'm assuming you can enter in any amount of information that you would like. So, for example, one of the things that I tend to do, so let's just say that for contracted work, hiring a trainer to come in and do a planning session, I would put the dollar amount for the trainer. Say they cost, $15,000 or $5,000 per training session. I'm doing 3 training sessions. I would put $15,000 in that contracted work. In the description, I would put, them paying for X training, energy efficiency training for this example. And then, sometimes I will even just note in there, training 1, we plan to have occur in Portland, Oregon. Training 2, we plan to have occur. And again, I'm going back to my first example, which was regional in Seattle, Washington, and then another one back in Portland. For this one, if we're going to get Portland specific, say we were doing 3 training sessions, it could be, a little more specific. It could be first one is this date, and second one is in the next quarter, and the third one is in the last quarter or something like that. So it's just kind of adding a little bit more information. For me, it gives a little bit of comfort in terms of being able to tie my budget to things I've said in my narrative. So I just kind of wanted to offer that. And then just also taking into consideration, if you're looking at sort of a longer duration project, you can also utilize that description section for saying, this is what we're looking to accomplish, sort of equipment acquisitions in year 1 and equipment acquisitions in year 2, and say this is a 3-year project. And maybe by year 3, you're not really looking to, acquire as many, and you can maybe note that, that you're not looking to do that, and that, during years 1 and 2 is probably your more intense time in terms of expenses. So it's just really utilizing these description boxes to be able to provide a little bit of information, but not overutilizing them, because you've already got the narrative to provide that. And I'm just going to pause there and let the folks that are well versed in this add their thoughts. If not, go ahead.
Well, we could hold questions for just a little bit longer, and then I did want to go kind of through some of the questions that were asked earlier on. So yeah, we can keep going, but for folks that did put in questions earlier, know that we will be getting to them soon.
Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right, I think this is where I was getting to, jumping ahead in terms of wanting to make sure that in terms of putting together the, as I mentioned previously, taking into consideration personnel. That's one of the things I've learned sort of early on as I was putting my budgets together, is taking into consideration how you break down putting personnel and who within the organization is actually going to be involved, and then being able to calculate one that is, so for example, generally our executive director is always involved, her executive assistant is consistently involved, and then we always often have our bookkeeper accountant involved. And so I typically am having to figure out and build that into my project budgets and do that sort of calculation within that. And really oftentimes for the purposes of this exercise, you know, this putting together these numbers is not my area of expertise. So I really rely on our bookkeeper and accountant to help me make sure that these numbers are accurate, because they tend to have the best understanding of our organization's budget and the best understanding of actually other project budgets that are going on. So for this particular calculation, in terms of consideration of personnel from at least the preparer standpoint, does require work and assistance from other folks within the organizations I work with. I've never attempted to try to make these estimations on my own. So that's just kind of my perspective on this particular personnel worksheet. So again, I want to offer any other thoughts or open it up if PCEF folks have anything else they wanted to add here. If not, we could go on.
I'll add one little thing. I had said earlier when I was referring to like the project budget table, which is above this table in the template, don't add lines here. That's different from this personnel budget table. Add as many lines as you need. So just want to make that clarification.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. All right, and then we can go to the next slide. All right, so within the budget worksheet, you have multiple tabs in there, and this is one of the tabs, which is the leverage tab or leverage table. And again, in talking with the folks at PCEF, the leverage component is not required, but is really helpful to have if you have resources that you are potentially already looking at or in the queue with. And again, adding that particular information in there, indicating whether it's secured, the amount of the anticipated source of or resources, and so forth. And I, again, want to make sure that I'm projecting that accurately in terms of sort of what the thought was on your guys' side.
Yeah, maybe just a quick note on clarification that for planning grants, there is no leverage table. And so it is really not leverage is not considered in planning grants. And then for the project grants, the small and large project grants, it's a very small number of points overall. And there was a question that came up that I think we'll get to in a moment, just about how to look at certainty of the funding that you put in here, and really to only put in leverage funding if you're very certain that it will be coming through to the project. And so this is an opportunity to bring additional funds into a project, but is not, as Darrell mentioned, is not required.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, and then I think I have two more slides to go, so we can go to the next one. So lastly, I just, again, as you're putting your budget together, it can vary in level of demand. My assessment would be that putting together the planning budget is a little more straightforward. Putting together the small and large project budget is going to require a little more involvement. But in terms of thinking about it, especially for folks that this is their first or their maybe third grant that they're putting together in terms of budget, is really, taking advantage of the resources that you have available to you. As I previously mentioned, my numbers is not my thing. my brain just does not work in that language. And so I really do rely on doing a lot of close work as I'm putting my proposals together with our folks that do the accounting and bookkeeping, or if that's a finance manager, which I've worked with, finance offices before on different grants. Sometimes it's been, depending upon the size of project, working closely with engineers that are helping, are part of the project team, or contractors who are knowledgeable in the specific area and making sure that this information is correct or accurate. Different vendors, making sure, again, like I mentioned earlier, if you're looking at a training event, you may need to go to a specific place that requires, it could be a training space that has a fee attached to it. So that could be a vendor, or even nonprofits. Some nonprofits will allow other nonprofits to utilize their training spaces at a fee. So those are kind of considerations to take into. Other nonprofit partners, being able to ask for assistance. I know first time I ever wrote a grant, that's who helped walk me through the process, was working with another nonprofit partner who actually was not applying for the grant that I was applying for. And so they were a very helpful resource in looking over my materials, helping me put the budget together. Of course, you may have other resources at your access to tap to help you. So if we could go to the next slide, which is my concluding slide. So again, kind of taking a summary of kind of where we've been through this process of talking about the budget. I'm really wanting to highlight the blue box in terms of walking through, again, the process of building a budget is mainly a lot of information gathering for you to be informed as you start to populate the actual worksheet itself, and to be able to put those numbers in, and also to be able to provide an explanation as to what those numbers mean in the description boxes in a clear and concise way. And then, of course, just to mention again that how the sort of synergy between the budget and the narrative itself is. But again, really for today is utilizing the budget itself as a way to tell the sort of resource story that matches what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So I just want to thank everybody today for listening, and hopefully that added some information and help to your process as you are working on your budget.
That was amazing, Darrell. Thank you so much. I learned even from listening to you, so thank you. Okay, we have quite a few really great questions that have come up through the chat. I'm gonna start at the very beginning here. The first question that came up: I understand the items necessary to support projects such as stipends for participation are covered. Is that correct? That is correct. Stipends for community participation are allowable expenses, with the caveat that participants, people who are benefiting from projects, PCEF funded projects, need to be residents of Portland. Okay, and the next question: can PCEF funding be applied to a second phase of a project that has already started, i.e. a project we already conducted outreach and design, but need further funding for the build out contractors? And the answer is yes. If the project phase is new work and implementation, that could be eligible. We recognize that there are numerous steps involved in developing and then building a project. Yeah, I think that, does anybody want to add anything to that?
Oh, yeah, I think that's accurate. But just with the caveat that, in this presentation and this Q&A, we really can't provide specific guidance on a grant proposal. So we're trying to define and provide boundaries of kind of what is eligible, or answer clarifying questions, but we're not trying to provide guidance on people's individual applications. So
Cool.
Just setting that framework.
Yep, important. Thank you, James. Okay, this next question we've kind of talked about, but I think it's important to hit it again because it's an important topic. So the question is, when dealing with incentives that are not certain, like ODO or Energy Trust, should we include them in our budget? So that would be a form of leverage that you might bring. So the answer to that question, it's a two-part question. So I'll do the first answer first. If you have a high degree of certainty that you will qualify for these incentives, then include them in the leverage table. If you don't have a high degree of certainty that you will receive these funds, then don't include them. Yeah, that's terribly descriptive. That really tells you what to do. They represent a small percent of your score and are not required to get a grant. And in addition, be aware that PCEF funds will not be dispersed until the match or leverage that you defined in your application is in place. So request what you think you need. The second part of the question, should we apply for more and then not use all the budget if we get these incentives? Again, request what you think you need. And yes, if additional funds come in, that is great. And it is not a bad thing for you to say, PCEF, we don't need as much money as you awarded us. The final details will be outlined in the grant agreement you create with your grant manager. Okay, let's see. June was helping us out and provided some answers in the chat about who to contact and where to find information. How do we handle overhead for contracted partners? This is the one. Are the partner costs inclusive of overhead, or does overhead for primary and partner organizations go into the same cell in the template? And the answer is that partner or contractor costs should be inclusive of their overhead. In the overhead section, that applies only to the applicant organization. Does anybody have more to add to that?
No, that's spot on. It's just remembering that personnel, overhead, those things are asked on behalf of the applicant organization, and those other items are with those folks you're contracting with.
Yeah. Okay. And feel free, if you need more clarification on any of these questions, just let us know. With follow-up questions are definitely welcome. Let's see, next question. Will we have to list specific individuals or just positions involved? We have a number of people in the same positions that could potentially be involved, and it would be preferable to have it be by position, not by individual person. And the answer is absolutely, it is fine to list the position. We understand and anticipate that the individual may not be in place yet, that would be funded by the grant, or there may be turnovers. So I think it's actually a very good idea that the role and the cost are identified, but aren't necessarily tied to a specific person. Okay, let's see. Can you confirm that the project budget table refers exclusively to the funds being asked for and not the actual budget for the specific project? I think this is a really good question. So the answer here is the template asks for the total project cost and the PCEF portion of the budget. So note that if the project is large, like say that you're building an affordable housing project, you would not enter the whole project in the template, just the part that's relevant to PCEF. So the part of that project that's relevant to PCEF would likely be the energy efficiency component of that build. If you wanted to install solar on the affordable housing project, that would be another example. You would enter the cost for the solar as the project budget for the PCEF funds. Did I get that right? Other folks on the staff?
Yep, that's where we were going with that. So it's about not the project that's the whole project, like an affordable housing complex. It's the project that you're requesting PCEF dollars of. So if that project is, we want to install solar or get to net zero, then you'd be talking about what those project costs are and what portion is PCEF and what portion are other sources of funds.
Awesome. Okay, I think we got everything that we have received up to this moment. And so we will hang on and we'll be here for a while. And there's still some more questions coming in, so we'll keep grabbing your questions. And then at some point before folks start to depart, do we have a closing poll on this webinar or do we not? I don't think. Oh, we do. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and launch the poll, and I'll just keep it active as we're answering questions that come in. If you do need to drop off early, just please do fill out the poll. So that'll show up here momentarily.
Wendy, do you want me to take the one from?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, so this question asks if an organization is renewable energy infrastructure focused, but the organization also wants to include some public education about renewable energy in the project, can that be funded by PCEF? James and June, Wendy, feel free to chime in. So yeah, education is allowable, particularly looked for when you're making an installation. It's great to let people know how to do the maintenance to ensure that the benefits are lasting over time. Like, here's how you have to maintain the thing that we installed. So that would definitely be something we would be looking for. And other education about energy is allowable. Note that at the end of the day, PCEF is looking at climate reductions in greenhouse gases, improvement in carbon sequestration that centers equity and delivers triple bottom line benefits. So those impacts on reducing carbon will be a thing that's considered in the application. But yes, education and outreach is allowed expense. June, James, Wendy, feel free to.
Yeah, no, I think you captured it well, Janet. Thanks.
That is right on. Next question, if partners are listed under contractor, do they also have to meet the 180% of minimum pay requirement? This is a good question. I don't want to misspeak, so if anybody knows, jump in.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay.
If you're being paid to work on a PCEF funded project, you have to be getting paid at least the 180% of minimum.
The only thing I wonder about is if you're paying a contractor a flat rate for a project completed. I'm not sure how we calculate that. So that was one point. Not that I should be the one asking questions, but
yeah, we can certainly double, triple check with Sam, but my understanding is that's not preferred because otherwise people can find ways to offload the costs and make that be a workaround. So why don't we hold that and we'll get a clearer answer for you when we post. But in general, the intent is that if you're working on a PCEF project, you're being paid 180% or more.
right.
Maybe just additional that when you're having conversations, as a piece of guidance, if organizations are having conversations either with other partners or with potential contractors, communicating that upfront is going to be really helpful to get a good estimate back from them about what their costs would be.
And apologies, I like sitting through so many of these, I forget if we did this today or yesterday, but just making sure that in that budget piece that you have that 180% of minimum wage changes each year in July. So make sure that if you have a multi-year project, that you've planned accordingly for those higher rates over time.
Okay, we got a few more comments in the chat. Alejandro, your comment about the project budget table, that it's doing something with match funds where it's adding to the expense. Is that we're gonna have to take a look at that and get back to you.
Or feel free to unmute yourself and you can kind of ask her. Yeah.
And maybe can you backwards to the slide that would have that?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and I can elaborate. My assumption is when I include the leverage as the funds that have been already secured or pledged, those would be subtracted from the overall ask of the for PCEF grant, understanding that the overall project cost would be eligible. However, the table adds them together. So, for example, I end up with a cost that it's higher than the project budget and higher than the ask.
Okay. I don't think that's what's supposed to be happening. So we will take a look at that and get back to you. So thank you for flagging that for us, and we'll see if there is something strange going on with that. And let's see. I don't think that there's
So wait,
anything.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding, Alejandro. So if you take the above this, the dark line there, that would be giving you all the costs of your project. And then overhead and fiscal sponsor is added on. And then
Oh,
the total. So actually, yeah, and I don't have it live, so I'd need to check. So it should be that the total, yeah, sorry. Yeah, we'll double check. I don't have that open live, so we'll double check and get back to y'all about that.
yeah, that I think I see where you're going with that, Janet, and I think you're right. I think that's as designed, because the leverage should be additive to, and it should be a part of like your total project cost. It shouldn't be
Because I think
upping.
what's happening is your leverage is on that other sheet, and that
Yeah.
auto populates where it says match fund. And then I think what happens is the total gets populated in under total, that it would have been your expense category subtotals, and then that overhead and fiscal, and then I think it auto calculates the other. But Katie made the math behind those, and I haven't looked at that, so we can double check.
We will double
Yeah,
check.
I'm sorry, want to point out that it could be misleading, because when the last line, when we talk about total project cost, it's not the project cost itself, but it's really the ask for the PCEF grant. So, so when we think about the overall cost of the program and the leverage is really the balance of what we don't want to ask PCEF for.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, and we might need to make a few small modifications to this, because I think you're right. And when I'm looking at the cells and I have it open separately, it is adding those two categories of PCEF project budget subtotal and then the match fund resources, which should probably be called leverage, because that's what the table's called. And then that becomes the total project cost.
Which makes sense. If your ask of PCEF is the PCEF project budget, but your total it should be, and then you add your leverage, and then you get your total project cost from there.
So I think the math is correct, but we just need to clarify that the PCEF project budget is the amount that is being requested.
Correct.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alejandro. And that, those are one of that's some of those things that seem completely obvious and make sense to us when we're building it. But until somebody new who hasn't stared at it for so long comes along and tries to use it, we don't hear about that, difficulties like that. So thank you. Okay, any other questions?
From Whitney.
Yeah, it's flat rate is how we work with some of our partners. It's not really a question. I think it's a comment on how the 180% minimum is applied when you are working with a flat rate contractor. Which I don't know if we gave a definitive answer about that, but I think that we were clear that the 180% applies, and I'm not sure how, we might have to do a little bit of work to figure out how that would be calculated on a flat rate contractor. And how are we doing on the poll?
Oh, good point. I will go ahead and end and share results.
Okay.
So yeah, sounds like a lot of folks are very likely to be developing an PCEF application this funding round, with about 73% of folks, working on grant applications. So that is great to hear.
Okay. Again, we will hang out until the top of the hour for any additional questions that might come in. But thank you all very much for joining us and for bringing your thoughts and questions and sharing them with us, because they not only help us to improve the process going forward, but they hopefully help everyone who is on the call. They get the benefit of hearing all of your questions as well.